So 5 of the 7 largest refiners in India will not take any Russian oil next month. 0. Now, for a country which had vastly expanded its intake of Russian oil to the point where it was taking in 40% of its imports of oil from coming from Russia, that's significant. China has sharply decreased its intake of Russian oil in November. It's down about 36% from last month. Now, if that was to continue, that's a significant dent in the Russian revenues. Turkey is moving away from taking Russian oil and diversifying its intake. And Turkey is Russia's 3rd largest customer.
Joining us today, Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program.
Well, thank you. It is so good to see both of you today.
Let's begin our discussion from the situation in the Kremlin. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been sidelined and could lose his seat at the top Kremlin stable, according to the recent reporting by Sky News. What is your take on that? And did Sergei Lavrov overplay his hand with Marco Rubio?
I think at this point, I have to be honest with you, from my own perspective as an analyst, that this is speculation at this point. There used to be, I'm old enough to remember a thing called the Cold War. And I remember growing up in the United States, there would be what we call Kremlinology, who was photographed where and who was not in the photographs. And did this mean they were on the in or on the out? I think it's clearly the case that when there was the breakdown after the Putin phone call with Donald Trump on October 16th, this was the one that was supposed to lead to a summit in Budapest, that just before that broke down, there was this conversation between Lavrov and the U.S. Secretary of State Mark Rubio, and everything went wrong. I personally think it probably went wrong because the Russians, and we've mentioned this in our previous broadcast, the Russians demanded too much. They demanded that for this summit between Trump and Putin, that the Americans recognize their seizure of all of the Donbass, including the Donetsk region. And that was just too much for the Trump administration. I don't know if Lavrov was blamed for that breakdown. That's where the speculation comes in. I think, to be honest with you, if there was a breakdown, it's probably because Vladimir Putin was demanding too much. But it's plausible that Putin blamed Lavrov for the fact that the summit didn't take place. But I'm also cautious because Lavrov has reappeared this week. Ironically enough, he reappeared again in the context of a conversation with Rubio, one in which he restated the Russian demands, to be honest with you, which is, the root causes of the conflict must be dealt with, which is code for not only give us more territory, lift sanctions on us, and get rid of the Zelensky government. I would say this is one where we just wait and watch, because I want to be honest with you. I mean, if Sergei Lavrov was to be pushed out or given another job, he's a very talented individual. He's a very ruthless individual. But even if Putin lost his skills, the invasion would continue. Putin has lost other advisors. We talked about Dmitry Kozak, for example. Sergei Lavrov is not going to be the defining moment of how this invasion ends, even if his own personal future is one where he's being sidelined in the Kremlin.
But don't you think that there could be a kind of blame game between Lavrov and Vladimir Putin for this cancellation of Budapest summit?
Again, we could speculate that. I mean, from the standpoint of Lavrov's always been a loyalist. I mean, he's whatever Putin has done, whatever Lavrov has thought about what Putin's done, he's never publicly come out against Putin or even challenged him significantly privately. So, that would surprise me if Lavrov was making a move against Putin. From, the standpoint of Putin, he is temperamental. He does replace advisors. He's replaced his military commanders frequently. during this invasion. He's gotten rid of other political advisors, but Lavrov has been his constant, for so many years that, again, I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened, but Putin has not moved before to get rid of Lavrov. So why now? But I also you can sense my caution here. And the caution that I take is that I think it's an easy reach because all of us would like to see this invasion stop. It's an easy reach to say, the Kremlin's falling apart. There's all this infighting. This shows that they're finally at a breaking point. And as much as personally I would like that to happen, realistically, I know that may well not be the case, that Putin has replaced other military commanders. He has replaced the other political figures, and still the invasion has carried on. So, yeah, if there's a disagreement between the two men, I don't think it changes that much. If Lavrov was to be set aside, the biggest effect I would have is that I find it difficult for any successor to be as good as he is in terms of what he does. He is perhaps the ultimate diplomat stroke disinformation activist, that he can blatantly lie, and yet he can get many people to either believe the lie or many people think that the lie is in their best interest. And he has no moral compunction about those lies. There's nothing that stops him from saying that Ukraine has a Nazi government, or that Russians have no rights in Ukraine, or that NATO is the real threat here. And he'll say it with a straight face. I do think there's one thing that may have caused a bit of tension that I will put out there, though. The one thing that Lavrov did that surprised me, because it was so out of character, not out of character for Russians to do this. I've seen Russians like Medvedev do this, the former president. But when Lavrov, do you remember that at the time of the Putin-Trump meeting that he showed up in a sweatshirt with the USSR on it, or in Cyrillic, CCCP as it reads to us if we see it from outside. So he's wearing a sweatshirt with, Soviet iconography on it. And it's like, wait, you all are supposed to be saying that you're friends with the Americans and that Trump is friends with Putin, and you're telling everybody USSR? A lot of Americans don't like that. That was a weird misstep by Lavrov. But at the time, I didn't think it would have that much significance. Now, whether it's that type of moment that others have seized upon and said, he really messed up the public messaging because of that. That's the one thing that kind of sticks in my mind that says, could it really be something as basic as that?
Another interesting topic is also about some news from investigative journalists about Putin, because journalists from the Radio Free Europe and the Current Time have discovered that Putin has at least 3 identical offices in different regions in Russia. So basically, it means that he doesn't want to, for audience and for his own people to know where exactly he is at this moment of time. Does this reveal a growing sense of paranoia or extreme concern for his personal security?
I speak as an outsider here, first of all, but as an outsider who has watched Soviet and Russian political culture for many decades, paranoia is the default position that you take place. You look at what happened to Joseph Stalin, where when he had a stroke, nobody would go in and check on him for 24 hours, in part because they were worried if he was okay, he would have him executed, but in part because they really would be quite happy if he died. If you look at what has happened to other leaders who have been quickly dispatched from power, such as Nikita Khrushchev, you're never in a fully certain position in terms of the political culture that takes place. And of course, you and I could talk about a number of Russian politicians who've met very, very sad ends in recent years during the Putin years. So, certainly beyond the level of security, if you want to call it security, I think there is that element of always watching your back. What I find interesting here is not just that Putin is having to be very careful in terms of what he does. But that public image that you just mentioned that he projects, which is that they're identical offices. Now, in part, that may be, oh, we don't want you to know where I am. But in part, it's to tell the Russian people, this is normal. Wherever I am, this is my office. This is my seat of power. And that doesn't change, right? So it's to give that impression of stability, no matter what the situation is around Putin, no matter where he is, no matter whether he might have a threat against him, whether domestically or from a strike. And Ukrainians have, of course, struck Moscow in the past. So yeah, it's a bit of theater, and it's a bit of theater which is linked to the fact that just as we cannot say for certain that Vladimir Putin will fall from power, we can never say that he is fully assured in that seat that he holds.
I also want to mention about another theater, because starting in March 2026, Russian authority body Roskomnadzor will gain the authority to block websites and even shut down the internet across Russia. The war has been raging for 11 years now, and the full-scale war almost for 4 years. Why is Kremlin moving to tighten digital control only now? And what kind of outcome do you think Kremlin want to achieve?
Well, I mean, the easy part of that question is the final part, and that is in the type of system that you have in Russia, those who are in power, the Kremlin, those around the Kremlin, they want to control the flow of information so that it's their narrative which prevails. I mean, this has happened for some time in Russia. There have been moves to restrict mobile phone apps, for example, to limit what can come in on those. There's been increased surveillance of mobile phone applications that take place. There's been pressure even on providers that have cooperated with the Kremlin, such as Telegram, to provide more information to the Kremlin in terms of what happens. And so controlling of websites, it just so happens that part of what I get to do on a daily basis is also cover countries such as Iran. And, that's what happens in Iran, that they want to control the narrative when they feel like they are in a situation when they're at war. They want to restrict what Iranians can see. The Kremlin is at war through its invasion of Ukraine. That war is something that does have effects at home. They don't want the narrative of defeat. They don't want the narrative of uncertainty. They don't want the narrative of economic problems to spread too quickly, too far. So you're but the interesting thing about this is my experience also is from covering other places, and I've covered, Syria, Egypt, across the Middle East. When regimes have tried to restrict the internet, people who really want to get around those restrictions can do so, right? And so what I find interesting is going to be the public response to this. Do you have Russians that will continue to seek news even as the Kremlin tries to limit what they can pick up on? And I think that'll be a telltale sign, because if you think most of your population are going to side with you, if you think your population are fully behind your special military operation, you shouldn't have to do this, right? Because they support you. They support what you're doing. So if you're insecure, where you're starting to limit what they can see, you're not confident that everybody's with you indefinitely as you try to conquer Ukraine.
Also, U.S. Secretary of State Mark Rubio recently said that the U.S. was running out of options on sanctions against Russia. What does this mean? Because it seems like Trump's administration has not yet used all tools of pressure against Putin's regime, because they could also sanctions another Russia's oil companies, oil banks, and even prevent Russian banks from using U.S. dollar system.
I think that was yet another example of Marco Rubio saying, for goodness sake, why doesn't everybody just stop this, and why don't we have peace? And and he does this in different ways. So he's done it in the past by saying, why doesn't everybody stop this, or the U.S. is just going to walk away from all of this, right? Or why doesn't everybody stop this, or we'll just have to cut our assistance, And so now he says, why doesn't everybody stop this? Because, to be honest with you, we're not sure what else we can do. I think the practical side of what Rubio is saying here is that the U.S. is not going to expand those sanctions in the near future. But they have fired a pretty significant shot. I mean, let's talk about what they did do when they have imposed those sanctions on Lukoil, on Rosneft, on Russia's two largest oil companies that take full effect this month. India's 5 large refiners, so 5 of the 7 largest refiners in India, will not take any Russian oil next month. 0. Now, for a country which had vastly expanded its intake of Russian oil to the point where it was taking in 40% of its imports of oil from coming from Russia, that's significant. China has sharply decreased its intake of Russian oil in November. It's down about 36% from last month. Now, if that was to continue, that's a significant dent in the Russian revenues. Turkey is moving away from taking Russian oil and diversifying its intake. And Turkey is Russia's 3rd largest customer. So in a way, I'm not too bothered by Rubio saying this, because the fact here is that having held back for so long from doing anything that could really constrain Russia, the U.S. sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil have been major. And let me just expand on that just a bit. Beyond the fact that those countries are not taking Russian oil, or they're decreasing it, Lukoil is now in a position where its foreign operations are being crippled and may disappear completely. So their refinery in Bulgaria is being nationalized. Their place in one of the world's largest oil fields, which is in Iraq, is in jeopardy. They've effectively declared the possibility that they may be suspending operations there. There are other countries which are reportedly going to take action against Lukoil's interests. Either Lukoil has to sell up, as they're talking about doing in Switzerland, or their assets will be confiscated. Now, given that that's Russia's largest private oil company, that again has a huge effect. And that there's a lesson in that. The direct U.S. sanctions on Russia were never going to be the key here. The key was always going to be the secondary sanctions. That is, the sanctions on countries who deal with Russia. And the U.S. has finally gone into that territory, and it is having an effect.
Do you think that Russians really care about this recent U.S. sanctions against Putin's war economy, because they're trying to present that like they don't care about that? This narrative is being spread by Russian propaganda around the globe.
Well, I mean, the Kremlin better care about it, because the fact here is that the Kremlin was already in a position before these sanctions took effect, where the economy was flatlining, where the government budget was increasing sharply, where they had the possibility of entering recession and having inflation at the same time. And now if you're talking about a 35-40% cut in your oil revenues, that's the lifeblood for this invasion. They've run a wartime economy, and if you run a wartime economy, you can tell the people to sacrifice if you can fund the war by making them make that sacrifice. But when you have them make the sacrifice, and then you might not be able to fund the war as well, and I do think you're going to get that crunch point in 2026. Yeah, this makes a difference. And in the past, the head of one of Russia's largest banks, Hermann Greff, told Putin last week, and more importantly, someone leaked it that he told Putin that Russia's economy is at serious risk of stagnation. And in particular, its financial sector, its banks, may be facing serious difficulty soon because their loans may go bad. Now, that's one of Putin's key allies financially, who in effect has broken cover. Either he allowed it to be mentioned in the media, or someone has gone and told the media this is what he said. So there are people who are already concerned about the Russian economy, and the tightening of the sanctions is only going to increase those concerns.
I also want to discuss the situation on the battlefield, because according to what BBC reports, that given the heavy fog reportedly helped Russian troops advance deeper into Pokrovsk, a key city in eastern Ukraine, and we know that Moscow is trying to seize it for over a year. What's your, how do you assess the situation on the battlefield, especially with this news about Pokrovsk? Especially, can you compare what you said last week about Pokrovsk?
Yeah, I start with the standpoint that President Zelensky, the military, acknowledged that the situation is difficult, both in the Donetsk region where Pokrovsk is, but also in Zaporizhia, a region that you know quite well, Sofia, because the Russians have taken a few villages. They've made an advance there. Now, I still come back to this, that is that, however, if we start with Pokrovsk and the area in Donetsk, Pokrovsk has not fallen yet. The latest that we're being told by Ukrainian military is about 300 Russians that are inside the devastated city. The fighting goes on and it continues. Now, it may be possible that Pokrovsk will fall, whether in a few days, few weeks. But at this point, there's not a huge change in the situation in Donetsk from where we were last week. I think what has changed and what is perhaps of concern here is what happened in Zaporizhia, which of course is towards the south rather than the east. That front line had been relatively little change in it, and all of a sudden Russia has made a push there by taking a few villages and by threatening a couple of towns that in that region. If they could claim that, that would be the first significant events that they've made in Zaporizhia, to my mind, probably since 2023. I'll have to go back and double check that. Now, this is not guaranteed. The fighting is ongoing. So I'd say at this point, you have a battlefield which is in flux. It's not a question of victory or defeat. It's a battlefield which is in flux. But if Russia could advance in Zaporizhia and take Pokrovsk, they could at least tell their people that they have made moves on these two fronts. But I'll actually add one other thing here, and we'll link up what we've said about the battlefield, which we said earlier. This may be Russia's last best hope to win. They have got to throw everything at this because they may not be in a position where they can do this next spring because of the economic position, because of the tightening sanctions, and because even Russia, with its advantage in manpower and resources, does not have unlimited military capabilities. I am not surprised that Russia is stepping up these attacks before we get into winter, both the aerial attacks and the attacks on the ground, because that's the logic here. If you know that you may only have 6 months to do this, you don't reduce your operations. You throw everything but the kitchen sink. As we say here in Ireland, you throw everything but the kitchen sink at Ukraine and see if you can break them.
Another interesting statement was made by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Radoslaw Sikorski, and actually it was his third time or second time when he mentioned it. He said that Ukraine will need support for another 3 years. And I'm really curious, why specifically 3 years? From your perspective, what does that suggest about what might come next? What should we expect? Because we know that some intelligence and even our president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, said that the West could also face the war with Russia in 3 years. So I'm really curious.
No, I'm not sure why Sikorski picked out the standpoint of 3 years. I mean, because there's some officials in Europe, both military and civilians, who are saying, look, you've got to prepare for this type of conflict with Russia indefinitely. or at least as long as Putin is in power. And that could well go beyond 3 years. Without being able, I mean, it'd be lovely to get the foreign minister to come in and explain this to you directly. I can't quite get inside his head on this one. What I would come back and say is Ukraine is going to need support for quite some time, even if we have a settlement. And I come back to what I've told you where I think this could land, and that is if Russia continues the invasion, you don't simply walk away from Ukraine. You don't simply cut your military and financial assistance. If we get to a point where the invasion is halted, I think we have to accept that the scenario where Russia is in occupation of probably 19% of Ukraine, the existing figure, for the foreseeable future. We don't like that, but that might have to be the position that you accept. It's going to be essential that the other 81% of Ukraine receives all the financial and economic support and military support, first of all, so Russia does not attack again, and secondly, so Ukraine has this path of becoming a country that develops its economic, its political strength. It will be a question of a path to joining the EU. And Ukraine should join the EU, not as a country which is a basket case, is crippled. It should be a country where it has its industrial potential, its agricultural potential, its financial potential should be supported. That's where I would read Sikorsky's statement, which is more of that if this invasion is halted, that does not mean this is the end of what takes place, that Ukraine now has to be seen as part of Europe, not simply this country that Europe came in to help.
Let's cover also current developments from Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that he would provide full support to the investigation of corruption scandal related with his former business partner, and also the corruption probe has already forced out two government ministers in Ukraine after President Zelensky demanded their resignation. Don't you think that many people are losing and do not understand the main issue here, that this would not ever happen in Russia?
Look, I agree with you that you would not have this type of investigation of corruption in Russia. But I'm going to say this with respect to you and your viewers, that this is not my starting point. And now I'd like to speak to you not just as an analyst, but as you know, as a supporter of Ukraine's resistance. When you have Ukrainians who have faced this battle for their existence for more than a decade, because as Sofia mentioned, this actual Russian invasion goes back to 2014. When they face a full-scale invasion since February 2022, and when they have sacrificed so much, when they've been told, quite rightly by their government, that the government is part of making that sacrifice, which is the way that it should be, if you have certain individuals, and I need to emphasize, these are all allegations at this point, these have not been tried in court. If you have certain individuals who have not made the sacrifices, but who have profited from what has taken place, and if they've profited to the tune of, I'll just use our currency because rather than Ukrainian currency, if they have profited to the tune of millions, tens of millions of dollars, that hurts, I would think, with respect. That hurts you if you're in the armed forces and you've put your life on the line for Ukraine. That hurts you if you have been a relative of someone who might have been killed in this. That hurts you if you have not been on the front line, but you have worked your hardest at your job to keep the country going. That just hurts. And I think there is an element that if those individuals have indeed taken tens of millions of dollars, especially if it's been illegal, that's a betrayal. I mean, that is a betrayal of the nation, but it's a betrayal of each and every Ukrainian who did not go out to make a lot of money from what took place, but indeed lost their homes, lost their livelihoods, lost their friends, lost their family because of this. The facts of the case as we know it are this, or at least the allegations, that 8 people are suspected of taking up to $100 million in what we would call kickbacks. So money from suppliers to Ukraine's nuclear energy company. They got 10 to 15% of contracts, which was money that did not go into Ukraine's energy grid. It went into their pockets. And they got that by threatening those suppliers, allegedly, by saying, if you do not pay us, we will make sure you do not get another contract. We will block you from taking place. Now, it so happens amongst the people who were suspected, not convicted, but suspected, it so happens amongst this that you have a former deputy prime minister who is one of the people who is suspected. You have a former energy minister who is now justice minister or was justice minister until the forced resignation yesterday. And you have someone who was the former business partner of the current president, Vladimir Zelensky. These are very, very high-ranking officials. These are officials who, when they took office, would have sworn an oath to Ukraine. And if they are convicted, not only are they convicted of these criminal charges, they have broken that oath at a time when every Ukrainian has made their own personal oath that they would stand by the nation.
Thank you, Professor Lucas. Let's see how these things will play out, and we will observe this matter and also discuss in the nearest future, as there would be another interesting developments related to this and also to the war in Ukraine. Thanks for your time, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you. Slava Ukraini.